from family life to a dogfight in the Battle of Britain.
My grandfather said to me, "We've done a great thing, we've done a wonderful thing, we've defeated evil."
And how they filmed the victory celebrations in their own streets and towns.
I was with my eldest sister and my mum watching people dance, and they were actually crying and saying how wonderful it was to think that it was all over.
Meanwhile, documentary makers made films calling for change. All captured people's lives and the impact that war had wrought. Deep in southeast England, during the early days of the war, an amateur cameraman, Victor Don, loved filming the visitors to his wonderful garden. One such visitor was his young nephew.
My uncle, he was actually a surgeon in a hospital in Ashford in Kent, and he had a practice as a GP as well, and I used to visit him with my mother. They had a number of cairn terriers who were very keen on playing around, and Victor was keen on taking their pictures for the general delight of everybody. My memory of most of what he did was, of course, colour. He had all the gear that was available to take his own films, and he used to show the films to us in the house. But he also had the kit that would enable him to show in a village hall. There's quite a size of pond, and I remember playing in it and trying to catch the fish. And at some stage in this film, there is one of these divers that you can suck the water into, and he goes down and comes back up again. Never did find out what happened to it.
In 1939, war had been declared against Nazi Germany, and within a year, Hitler had created plans for the invasion of Britain.
It was vital that the Germans got air superiority over southeast England, and what we now know as the Battle of Britain was just the battle for daylight air superiority that was fought out between the Luftwaffe and Fighter Command of the Royal Air Force, which began in July 1940 and petered out towards the end of October. Well, Victor was living in Ashford, and Ashford lay on one of the main routes that most of the German raids took going up to London.
As Victor Don was filming in his garden, fighter planes were in combat in the skies above. This is the only known amateur archive of a dogfight during the Battle of Britain.
I have this memory of Victor taking the film of what's going on above and then panning down into the garden where it was all peace and quiet and a few dogs and me. It was happening whilst we were all below, because there was hardly any connection beyond the fact that you could see those planes up there.
What Victor Don had managed to capture with his camera was actual confrontation between the Luftwaffe and the RAF during the Battle of Britain. Stephen Bungay takes us through the air battle.
It looks to me as if it's an engagement between fighters. We've got a small flight of aircraft, probably 4, with a lone one behind them. It looks as if because they've started to turn that they've probably seen a threat. Now here we have a whole formation of aircraft. It looks as if there's about half a squadron, and some fighting's clearly been going on higher up, because we can see that trail going vertically down, an aircraft falling as a casualty there. These chaps have been spotted by some others. They're flying a few thousand feet higher. They've spotted them. The aircraft below are beginning to maneuver, but the guys on top are starting to peel away now and come down on them in the classic maneuver, one after another, peeling down, trying to get on the tails of the ones that are further down, who you can see are starting to climb and make height, which is what you would try to do if you knew that there was a dogfight coming, and the dogfight clearly was coming. Here we have the classic curving maneuver. Dogfights were called dogfights because dogs try to get on each other's tails. The chances of surviving your first few dogfights are about 50-50. For the novice, it is like passing your driving test, being given 2 or 3 days to play around in a sports car, and then being entered for the Grand Prix. And by the way, if Michael Schumacher does come up against you, he's going to try and kill you, not overtake you. There's one lone individual streaking away. If you got separated, what you wanted to do was to get off home fast, because as an individual aircraft, you would be very vulnerable. That's a Spitfire that's clearly come down to very low level. This chap may well be out of ammunition by this time. We're used to contrails these days, of course, because there are so many aeroplanes in the sky, but in 1940 this was a new experience for most people. They'd never seen anything like it. So this added to the fascination. This was a new aesthetic. The blue sky with these white plumes of what appeared to be smoke was something which fascinated everybody, who of course also knew that a life and death struggle was taking place for their own country.
Geoffrey Gowland was making films in Croydon as war began. He captured the effects of war on his family, despite the wartime filming restrictions. He spent the war at home because he was in a reserved occupation, making lenses for gun sights.
I do remember Father filming because he filmed events as were going on. Perhaps what I remember almost more was him sitting working quietly in the evening, splicing films together, joining them together to make a longer sequence and putting titles in. He took an immense amount of trouble, so the finished product was really quite a presentable affair which he would show perhaps to friends and visitors as well as the family.
As children, we tended to groan, saying, "Oh, not again." But one of the advantages of this type of filming was that it could be done just with a handheld camera. And it's worth remembering that the cameras then were not battery powered, they were clockwork. You had to wind them up so that they would only run for a certain period of time. I think it was about 25 seconds.
The Gowlands, like every other household, had to prepare against the German bombers. Houses were blacked out and bomb shelters erected.
The first memories would have been of the shelter outside in the garden. I remember more about the indoor shelter much later in the war. It was supposed to be able to contain the debris from a whole house being bombed on the top, and you could still be there underneath. John, Mark and I slept on the top, and our parents slept on the bottom.
The new bomb shelters were built just in time. The Germans were about to unleash a new weapon, the V1. 142 landed in Croydon. Geoffrey Gowland made his son a toy replica of the new deadly missile.
On one occasion, Mother took John and I and Mark in the pram for a walk in a local park. And as we were walking, one of these flying bombs came over and the sound stopped, which was always a horrible feeling. We could see it diving down to earth and a bang. And we then walked home, wondering whether our house was going to be there. It affected us to a certain extent, but what our mother must have felt about it beggars belief now.
The V1 was very unnerving, but its military effect was almost zero. There was absolutely no point in bombing London with these things, except, as the name says, for revenge. V stands for Vergeltungswaffe, which means revenge weapon, and it was simply to get back at Britain for the bombing of Germany.
In Wales, Monica and Gillian were stars in their father's home movies.
My father would direct us in the beginning when we were very young, but later on, no, he would just sort of take things as they happened. As people have camcorders today, I think he got interested in cine photography, and really that was his main enjoyment as we were growing up.
The children's father was Reginald Isles. He hadn't enlisted because he had heart problems, so he spent the war at his home in Cardiff.
He worked for the Imperial Tobacco Company. He was a very quiet sort of person. He would show the films to us in the house, and also, you know, family relations, if he'd taken them, or various weddings. He would go sometimes to somebody else's house and show them there as well.
Reginald Isles filmed himself and his neighbours on duty as air raid wardens. South Wales had become a major target for the Luftwaffe, especially the docks around Swansea and Cardiff.
January the 2nd and 3rd, 1941, was the worst raid Cardiff experienced. 165 people died that night when Grangetown and Riverside were totally blasted off the face of the earth. That was also the night that a parachute mine landed in the grounds of Llandaff Cathedral and blasted the roof off the cathedral and damaged the inside of it. And it was the night that the line stand at the Arms Park took a direct hit. So the two religions, Anglican and Rugby, were damaged in that raid.
I can remember the air raid shelter. It incorporated the next door as well. At the start of the war, my grandmother was living with us, and my mother used to say it was quite frustrating to get us down to the shelter first, and then she'd go back for my grandmother, who was always dithering and always lost her handbag. We had bunk beds, my sister and I, and she used to sleep at the top, and I used to sleep underneath. But it was very cold. During the war, everything was on ration. I think we had about 2 ounces of butter a week, and our sweet ration was 4 ounces a month. And it was a very difficult time, but my sister and I suppose we were young, we really didn't know any better.
Mother kept hens, so we had eggs. She kept cockles, so we had chicken. And she even tried ducks, but they weren't very successful. We managed to get a little bit extra, but you had to make do with food. You couldn't just go out and buy anything you wanted to.
For the communities that lived near the docks, there was a way of getting extra food. Catherine Thomas's father worked on the quayside in Cardiff, and she recalls how he managed to get that little bit extra.
If it was a food boat, or occasionally a fruit boat, oranges, crates would be dropped off the crane and then they would be shared and they would take them home. Yes, things did come into our house, food, little food, not massive, but bear in mind they had to pass the docks policeman, perhaps 2 or 3, at the gates, and people were caught. My dad had a bicycle which knew its own way to the dock and back on its own. I can remember small tins of pilchards. They were down inside his boots, So lots of little things did come into the house. We always knew because Dad used to send us up with half a crown, 2 and 6, 12.5p, up to St. Peter's, put that in the poor box. And that, I think, was a way of his conscience being salved.
The British were sent food packages from the United States, but soon the Americans sent over not just aid, but troops.
The Americans didn't enter the war until after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And then they came to Britain in their thousands.
You had no option. You had to take an American soldier. And my mother said as we were having 1 soldier, well, we might as well have 2. I remember them quite well, actually. One was tall and one was slightly shorter, and they were both named John. The tall one was called John, and the shorter one was called Johnny.
The next-door neighbours also took in a GI. The Americans weren't aware of how little food there was.
My mother had made a batch of jam tarts, and there was one left, which she'd left in the kitchen cabinet for me. And John had come home before myself, and he'd eaten this jam tart. So my mother was absolutely furious with him. So was I.
Most of the neighbourhood had Americans billeted on them. They seemed to fit in with the community perfectly all right. They were very nice, very polite. The Americans did have one rather bad fault. They used to steal dogs.
The American soldiers, I think probably they were quite lonely and didn't have any family or pets or anything, obviously, over here. And we did have one dog that went missing. And I remember my father cycling all over Cardiff looking for him. And we'd really given up hope when, I don't know if it was our Americans or the one that was living next door, but they found him eventually in the American camp.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
Free at last from filming restrictions, Reginald Isles caught the celebrations in Cardiff.
My father wanted to record VE Day, and I can remember him giving this bottle of wine to my mother to hold. Obviously, it didn't mean quite so much to my sister and I. We knew it was a very happy time, but my parents were obviously very, very relieved.
I remember the street parties. I remember the dancing in the street. There were 50,000 people on VE Day outside the City Hall. The BBC radio message came over on the tannoy to say the war was over. And it sparked the signal for these 50,000 people to cheer, to dance, to sing, to kiss, to hug, and to do the knees up Mother Brown right throughout the night. The Salvation Army band and everybody else who could play an instrument went through the streets playing hymns. Everybody joined in this great jubilation. One aspect of this is that the kids didn't turn up for school. They were too tired. The factories, nobody turned up for work. The trams kept running, just about, but not always. Some of them abandoned their trams to join in the dancing and the singing.
The ladies made bunting. All clothes were chopped up and made into flags and strung on strings, and we had these all over. Another thing I can remember now is painting jam jars. Painting jam jars, the equivalent now of our lights, our Christmas tree lights. And we painted these jam jars, and they all had a little night light in, different colours, and strung the whole length of the garden.
We joined forces with the house next door to us, and they put lights up with a V on it. And I can remember there was a very big party in the gardens that night, and there was a torchlight procession in the park. Anybody could join in with the celebrations.
From every lamppost in every street, they hung an effigy of Hitler, or they threw an effigy of him on the bonfires. Cardiff, like every other town and city in Britain, was under blackout restrictions. But on VE Day, Cardiff was given an exemption. It was the only place along the South Wales coast that was allowed to light up. So the crowd that gathered outside the City Hall gathered in front of an illuminated City Hall. And that was a great moment for the people of Cardiff.
It was also a day for the Gowlands to celebrate in Croydon.
On VE Day itself, we children were allowed to carry out the blackout screens, and we put them in a pile on the empty lot on the opposite side of the road from us. One of the children was quite concerned about this and said to Father, "Won't the wardens be cross with us tomorrow?" That's how children get accustomed to these things. That night at about 10 or 11 o'clock, our parents woke us up to go to the window and look out, and they had a bonfire of them.
In Wakefield, West Yorkshire, Fred Wilkinson's films are brought back to life by his family.
No, it's a little girl. There's Fred. There's Fred.
And the red carnation?
Yes. He just lived for taking film. From the early days, it was just his life to do filming, which he liked to take and show people. He got more of a thrill, I think, taking it to show people than he did actually filming it.
Fred Wilkinson became a baker after marrying into a confectioner's family. Through hard work, the business prospered and gave him the means to become an amateur filmmaker.
The fact that my grandfather was a baker, he had daily contact with people in the community, and I'm sure word of mouth must have spread that he was an excellent cake maker and icer, and also an excellent filmmaker. And I'm sure that the contact of the women coming into the shop on a regular basis to buy their bread would have meant that he did an awful lot of this sort of filming.
The world will sing again.
With the end of the war, the people of Wakefield went out on the streets to celebrate, and Fred Wilkinson managed to film them.
Our meeting.
It was a very exciting time for everybody. We'd had such a devastating 4 or 5 years, and at last it was all over and everybody seemed to, a big sigh of relief. I was with my eldest sister and my mum, stood watching people dance, and they were actually crying and saying how wonderful it was to think that it was all over, because we'd never seen this. It was dark days and we'd never seen people like this dancing and singing in the street. I can see it now as if it was yesterday, but you just can't express the feeling that people had. And loving one another and kissing one another and dancing with people you've never seen before in your life. And it was wonderful.
The world will sing again.
People said, there's going to be a procession. Oh, great, we'll all go and watch. And all the kids from our street, and I mean hundreds of kids, all went up to watch this procession. There was that many wagons, it was absolutely unbelievable. And the music, there were bands playing. And when the procession had passed, at the tea time, people began to dance.
It was wonderful because the lights were on and everybody was happy and talking and cheering and finding one another to say, isn't it lovely, and getting hold of one another and jigging around because we were so happy. We knew all the people would be back from the war, and we all sort of thought, well, now nobody's going to get those awful telegrams to say someone's been killed.
And then we suddenly heard, oh, they're going to build a big bonfire in the local Providence Street. And it was built with old sleepers. And it went up and up and up and up. And it was huge. We'd never seen anything like it. And then they filled it in with all sorts of trees, and bushes and boxes. And it was absolutely huge.
Thank God that's over. What's over? Well, the war, of course.
It's not, not our war.
Oh, what do you mean?
For Paul Rother, filmmaking wasn't a hobby, it was his profession. As a committed socialist, he believed his films would not just reflect British life, but change it.
Paul Rother saw documentary as a persuasive medium which could put across to people the reality of living in the modern age as it then was. So he really wanted to put across what real people's lives were like and what the issues of the day were.
Funny, isn't it? We're so quick to clear up the results of bombing, and yet we still haven't cleared up the chaos of the last 100 years.
At its heart, it's a film about planning towns and planning good housing for people to live in, but it's part of a broader picture which is concerned with planning everything.
It isn't only houses we want, it's whole neighbourhoods, do you understand? We'll need schools that are handy to the houses and away from main roads. We'll want the shops where we can reach them. We'll want health centres, clinics, libraries, nurseries, parks, cinemas, theatres, the whole bag of tricks, located, designed and carried out to a proper plan. We know how to do it and we're going to do it. Stop!
Rotha comes to believe that you can continue state control of all sorts of aspects of life into the post-war period and thereby make a more rational world.
They're all the same. They promise you the moon and nothing ever happens.
Despite Rotha's calls for planning, post-war housing policy was chaotic. The homeless families needed an immediate solution, and they took matters into their own hands.
Now a story from Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire, which Movietone presents without prejudice or comment.
Nearly 50,000 people moved into disused military installations.
Needing somewhere decent to live.
Roy Cross recalls that summer of 1946.
I was at school one day playing cricket. Somebody said, "I think your mother's waving to you." And I looked over the fence and there was a horse and dray. And it was piled high with furniture. I knew nothing about this. So I goes running over and they says, "We're flitting." I said, "We're going to Botsford camp." I says, "What's squatting like them at Sawcliffe?" She says, "Yeah." She says, "Oh," I says, "I hope it's a decent place." My stepfather says, "I've had a look round and we've got the best of what was left."
The people in Scunthorpe, they didn't object to the people taking over the squatters' camps. They were there, they weren't being used, and there were roofs over their heads for a lot of people who had just nowhere to go. There weren't any council houses, they hadn't started building council houses.
This is only one of many ex-army camps taken over by the thousands of ordinary, hard-working folk. Yesterday they were cold in hospitable huts. Today they're homes.
The council decided to charge them rent. Well, the squatters weren't all that keen on paying rent. They'd done a lot of work themselves at these huts.
We always said that if they were prepared to supply the dustbin men and the electricity and the gas, we're prepared to pay rent and rates. And the council says fair enough. And this is what they did.
With family life returning to normal after the war, the Isles family decided that city life was no longer for them. Reginald Isles filmed their move to the Vale of Glamorgan. It was the beginning of a new film career, and until the year he died, Reginald Isles filmed the local annual agricultural show. A decade after filming the Battle of Britain, Victor Don was invited to the christening of one of his patients. Of course, he brought his camera. The boy was called Michael John, and he was the second son to Lord and Lady Brabourne, grandson to Lord Mountbatten. Michael John's godmother was Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen. To find out more about Britain during the war, go to open2.net, and for details of all Open University programmes, either log on or call 0870 900 0303.
If you or someone you know lived or fought during World War II, then your memories are part of our history. The BBC is preserving them in a unique archive. Add yours to the website at bbc.co.uk/WW2.